Good morning, students. In my previous video, I just gave you an introduction about the author of this story, Drought Sharat Chandra Chatterjee. To give you more details about story, in my this video, I will let you know how things happen and how a poor man was forced to leave his native place. The story begins with a formal way of storytelling, and as writer has the first sentence of the story is that the village was called Kashipur. So we can very well understand that the background of the story is Kashipur, and it was a small village. And when we talk about small village, especially the village in pre-independence era, we can very well imagine the settings of village. And the village, as it was governed by landlord, zamindar, there were few common characters which were present almost everywhere in the village. And this was that how the story begins. And the name of the zamindar was he was a zamindar, and his was name was Tarak Ratna, as we come to know. And Tarak Ratna was the name of the priest, and zamindar was an orthodox person who believes absolutely what Tarak Ratna, the priest, preached him to do so. So, in the backdrop, if we look at the story, we find that Tarak Ratna was a villain who was known for his evil, I can say his evil counseling, advice, and the way of tormenting poor people. Now we come to know about the main character, and this character his name is Gafur. Now, when we the moment we listen about Gafur, the reader can very well apprehend what is going to happen, because this has something which has a relation with class conflict also. So Gafur, he was a poor farmer, and he had a land, but he was forced to work as a laborer under the zamindar, the landlord. And Gafur has bull, and the name of the bull was Mahesh. Now, Gafur, despite of his efforts, he couldn't feed Mahesh, his bull. And at that time, Tarak Ratna enters in the story. And as I just read some line to quote, Tarak Ratna said, I saw it tied there in the morning, and it is still there. If the bull dies, your master will lay you alive. He is an ordinary Brahmin. He is no ordinary Brahmin. Now, this threat comes to Gafur that he has to take care of Mahesh. Then he said that how can I feed him? How can I graze him? And Mahesh was starving. He was dying of hunger. Tarak Ratna, he was very harsh, and he was being very cruel to Gafur. And then when Gafur requested him that how can he feed, what is his fault, he's a landless owner, he's a landless worker, Tarak Ratnal softened a little and he said that, okay, what about the grain which I gave you, handful of grain which I gave you as your fees or as your the an amount of work which you did working in the landlord's land. Tarak Ratna said that I gave you, you can just use that rice and you can boil it and eat it. Now Gafur, he was so helpless. And he says that the grass is insufficient for him. He has no grains. And this all condition, worsened condition, is created because of drought. Drought means that that year there was no rains. And as we all know that in pre-independence era, farmer totally depended himself on the grace of God. It was all the climatic conditions that helped him, or if conditions went worse, they would be forced to starve and to die. So he says, no, we don't have that much of grain, that much of grain or wheat with us, rice with us to feed a animal. And in this way, the things get on worsening. One major incident happened, and that was Mahesh was died, and because of hunger, he let himself free and he went into the landlord's field, where he was mercilessly, ruthlessly beaten, and Gafur had no option left with him. He was in a trauma that how can he take him out of the enclosure where he was enclosed. He had no money, he had nothing to pay as a penalty, and as a result, Gafur sold his brass plate. He had only one single belonging left to him. He quietly went there, though this brass plate was, he exchanged money since many times, but this time also this was the last resort for him, so he could get money, and out of that money he paid the penalty and released Mahesh of the enclosure. Everything moves in a more pathetic manner. Things get worse. The atmosphere becomes gloomy, very saddened, and Gafur, he himself was not physically fit. He was also dying of thirst. He had a daughter named Amina. Amina was a small girl, but conditions and circumstances have made her mature. The plight in the village was that everybody was not allowed to drink water from the same well. So somehow Amina managed to get a pitcher full of water. This pitcher full of water may seem to be a very small and insignificant thing, but it was of great use for Gafur and Amina, because Gafur was dying of thirst. He had nothing to eat. Rice water, which they previously consumed, was also finished. They had no grain left in their house. Mahesh was also starving, and Gafur was having fever. And in that traumatic condition, when Amina somehow managed to bought a pitcher full of water. The climax was so pathetic that Mahesh couldn't control, since Mahesh was an animal and he couldn't control his thirst. So he just released himself, and in order to drink water, Amina, he got encountered with Amina, and Amina's pitcher, which was made of clay, it fall down from her hand. And Mahesh did not bother even to look at anything, and he started drinking water from the leftovers of that earthen pitcher. This gave so much of, I can say, pain to Gafur that he couldn't control himself, and he started beating him. The beating was out of frustration, out of his inability, out of his plight, whatever, but because of his beating, Mahesh, since he was hungry, he was also starving, he couldn't bear that much of pressure, and he died. The death of Mahesh left Gafur in such a state where he had no other option left for him. And then he somehow took all his whatever things left with him, he just rolled them, and in the night, he and his daughter, they vanished from the village. Because the aftermath of Mahesh's death was also not less tormenting as when Mahesh was alive. So, in this state of condition, in this state of mind, Mahesh was left alone, and Gafur, he was forced to leave all his loving things and belongings in the village. Whatever he could take, he took it, and was forced to go to nearby place where he could work as a peasant, and which was probably in some jute mill. So this story, Drought, is, it forces the reader to think of so many things, and we are automatically, we feel sympathy, we in an empathy for those poverty stricken people, for those poor people who become landless and after that who were deprived of their own roots and were forced to stay outside their native place. So the villagers running towards or rushing towards urban area was somehow, sometimes not a good choice for them, but it was the circumstance, it were the conditions that forced them to do so. Because we can very well understand the pain and the anguish of leaving our own roots and to be derooted from our actual place.